On this episode, we discuss the death checklist, things that you might need to know, where to go, who to talk to, and how to prepare for your own death.
Because when your death comes, you need to have that list ready.
Let's talk about death, baby. Let's talk about grief and mourning. Is it argumental or existential? What's it mean to me? Let's talk about death.
Hi, I'm Benny Cabal, and I'm a funeral professional.
And I'm Nicholas Cabal, a psychologist.
Hey, Nick, let's talk about death.
Let's do it.
Today, we're going to be talking about the death checklist, Benny boy.
Yeah, this is a kind of a thing I've wanted to talk to for a while on this podcast.
Well, here's your opportunity. Go ahead.
Well, let's get started. So a death checklist, my idea for this is I have the honor of taking care of all these families, and the ones that I find are more prepared have things in order. What does that mean? What kind of things should I start maybe checklisting, right? Even before you talk to your funeral director, start talking to your family, or at least your loved one, your spouse, or whoever is going to be in charge of taking care of you and your final disposition. Things to start getting in order are stuff that will help the death certificate, the obituary, and it'll also help the funeral director get things at least a lot smoother. For instance, maybe you have a specific casket you'd like. Maybe you have a specific cemetery you'd like. Maybe a pastor you'd really like. Dr. Nick, which I thought was really cool, I was talking to somebody about the checklist, and they brought up that they knew of somebody that in their will and also in their paperwork for when they died, they also had a list of their values, which I thought was super cool, right? Because we think of like the material side of that and the biographical side of that, when people did things, et cetera, but we don't take in consideration the values that we hold, right?
Absolutely. I think that's a beautiful thing to leave, especially the grandkids and the great-grandchildren, maybe the great-grandchildren that aren't old enough to really know great-grandpa, so that at least they're left with something that basically Grandpa wanted to hand down to them. I think it's a beautiful thing. But back to what you were saying, Ben, I think what you're kind of talking about or alluding to is a pre-need, right? What is a pre-need?
Yeah, so I mean, all of this checklist will eventually go into a pre-need, which I'll get to. But a pre-need is when you actually go on down to your local funeral director, and you set up everything. Now, whether that's financially or not financially, you could put everything down. So you put down the casket you want, the pastor, the church, what kind of services you want, how you want your final disposition to be. Put down where you're from, your social security number, your birth date, your ancestry, who your mother is with her maiden name, how many siblings that are still surviving, how many grandchildren you have. All of this can be done at any of your local funeral homes, and funeral directors would love to talk to you about this, because not only does it make it easier and smoother for your family and yourself and a lot less stress to deal with when it comes to the end, but it also helps out the funeral director too, because he already has basically a blueprint for exactly how you want to have your funeral, if your funeral or memorial service or direct cremation, burial, etc.
Now, I think a lot of listeners are wondering, Ben, does this cost money to do a pre-need with a funeral director?
So like I was saying, you could go in your funeral home and just do a record file, right? You don't have to pay money. In fact, a lot of people don't. They just come in and they'll say, like, Dave or Ben, when it's my turn, can you put down that I want that casket? Or can you put down that, I was thinking I wanted 2-day visitation, but now I only want 1. These are certain things you can talk to your local funeral director about. And nothing's set in stone either. It's not like if you go and you set this up, it has to be that way, right? Your family can switch things, or you can switch things down the line. If you're like, I really thought I wanted a nice stainless steel casket, Nick, but now, I really like the look of that cherry. I like that soft red tint of that cherry casket.
For viewers out there, I have already picked up my casket. It will be the cherry wood, and I would love the piano finish on it, to be honest with you.
Sounds nice. It sounds fancy.
It's it is fancy, but
Well,
I've always liked the look of the woods. Right, they're warmer. They're not cold.
Well,
I
let
don't know.
me-
That's just my experience.
Well, let me get into the checklist a little bit. We have Dad and I through the years have printed out stuff that'll help even pre-thinking about it, right? So if a family comes in, they're like, well, we want to do a pre-need or we want to do a consultation with you guys, but, we really haven't had anything, is there anything we can have that'll kind of get the ball rolling? We have documents they can take home literally. They could talk to their kids about. They could show them pictures, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the kind of stuff I want to talk about. So in that packet that you would take home, you would put in your name, right? Your birth date, where you were born. That's a thing for the death certificate. Social Security number, your parents, and when it comes to your mother, her maiden name. So biological father, biological mother, maiden name. Who is going to be the next of kin, or at least your contact, right? So we have that information for who to call or who's going to kind of be in charge, who's going to be running the show, basically, when it comes to that. Nick, we talked about it in an earlier episode, but let's say it's a person that you want to do this, but you're like, I have nobody who's going to be in charge because I don't have any family. I don't have anybody close to me. That's where this funeral representative can come in, and it's at least in the state of Michigan, we allow it where you pick somebody, you and them go to a notary. I think it's a notary or two notaries. You get it notarized. You bring it back to your funeral home. That legitimately document gives legal rights for that person to take care of all disposition, not anything else. Just specifically, they will be in charge of taking care of your body when you die. So another thing that you people should be starting to get in order is let your family know where life insurance policies are. Let your family know if you have an agent for stocks and bonds. Let your family know if there's any pensions or who to contact. Any paperwork, right? Because there's usually one safe or deposit box. And the problem is the older generation just didn't trust anybody, or either that or it was, I have plenty of time, right? You're 70 years old. I still have plenty of years. Well, that's not, and Nick, as you know, that's not very true.
Or they forget about it, right? I mean, that could be a big thing too, especially as they get older and dementia sets in and stuff like that. They might just need someone to remind them, hey, you got that safety deposit box, like you probably should tell someone about it.
Right, absolutely. And another thing to think about too, and this is on the legal side, I'm not going to get too much into it, but at 60 to 70 years old, you really should start thinking about having somebody as your POA or power of attorney eventually. And eventually, if you want to even go further, an executor will actually be able to take care of things afterwards. POA drops, the power of attorney POA drops when you die. But the executor, and I think there's another legal term, but I can't think of it right now, so I apologize. But that you have responsibility after the death.
Can they be both? Can you
Yes.
be the
Yeah,
power
you
of
could be a
attorney
power of
and the
attorney.
executor?
And you could be power of attorney for medical side, and you can also be power of attorney for financial side.
Okay.
So you can have one son who's really good with the books, take care of the financial side, and then you got the the one son that's maybe a doctor or nurse that can take care
Or daughter.
or daughter, et cetera, et cetera. But so these are the kind of things. Another thing is, if you were a veteran, please tell your family where your DD-214 is. If you haven't already, make sure you go to your local VA and take your DD-214 with you and put yourself on file. Because a lot of files were lost, and I can't remember where the fire was, but a lot of people's old DD-214s were lost by the government. So if you haven't had a chance, go to your local Veterans Affairs and sign yourself up and give them your DD-214. They may already have it, but it's just a great thing, and it'll make things go smoother when that comes down the line. Because your family, for you to get a flag, for you to get any money, or to be able to get the bronze marker for your tombstone, you're going to need a DD-214.
Now, you talked about a lot of the legality, the paperwork, that kind of stuff. I wondered, what is stuff for people to prepare for, maybe for the service?
Oh, very, very good. So, we come from a very religious Christian community. So I'll touch on that, and I'll touch on things that aren't. Things to think about would be Do you have a specific pastor in mind? Do you want the service in the funeral home, or do you want it at the church? Do you want a specific musician to play? Do you have certain songs that you would like played at your funeral? Are there is there any eulogist that you would really like to have at your funeral? Is there any things that you've seen through other funerals that you really like?
Like a bagpiper.
Bagpiper, letting a dove fly, balloon launch is a big thing. There's the memorial videos. That's another thing too. If you want a memorial video, realize it takes a lot of photos. So start getting your photos in now. Dr. Nick, we were talking about the other day how the older generation would put a bunch of pictures in a shoebox, right? So then at the end, or trash bags. I've heard of trash bags in a basement full of pictures, right? These are kind of things you can start getting in order. A picture for your obituary. Maybe even writing your own obituary. I think that's a very eye-opening experience to begin with, and I think everybody should do that. But also having a picture to go with that. It's very, I find it very cathartic, and I think a lot of families would agree with me that have done it. I get a lot of the older generation in their pre-need file, they'll have a handwritten obituary in it, or they'll send it and they'll keep revamping it, when more grandchildren come in. Also, and this is comical, but please find out how your grandchildren spell their names. Because so many times I know the name is Copernicus, but I have no idea how to spell it. These are kind of things to really start thinking, and it's kind of a little comical, but these are things that literally come across the board all the time.
What about if you're having a funeral or a visitation or an open casket situation? Can they pick out their own clothes?
Oh, that's a good thing, Nick. You brought up open casket, but
or jewelry and all that stuff.
You bring up open casket, and you can also have a closed casket. For some people, they don't like the idea of people looking at them in the casket. So that is an option too. You could tell your local funeral director, I still want to be embalmed, I still want to be made up, but I only want my family to see me, or I don't want anybody to see me. These are things you can do. Clothes, Nick, very good. Pick out your own outfit. Pick out your own suit or button-up shirt or blouse or, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that'll make it a lot easier for your children, too.
I got a question about the jewelry. Can you put in your pre-need, I want to be buried with A, B, and C?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, when it comes to that, though, yet again, the children do have a right on that.
So they have final
or
say.
Your spouse. So if they could change their mind at the last second, a lot of families will come in with jewelry, and it's 50-50 in their minds if they're going to take it out or not. A lot of individuals feel like a wedding ring should stay on their loved one because, it was always on them, so it's weird to see them without. But also, it represents that life bond. Right? But then other families are like, well, I want to give a mom's wedding ring to the first grandchild that wants to get married, or, and it passes as a family heirloom. I've seen it both ways, Dr. Nick. So I think it's just how the family incorporates it. Some look at if you leave jewelry in the casket, it's wasting money. Others look at it like it's a tribute, If you want to be buried with something, Nick, that's an interesting too. Maybe you want to be buried with your favorite golf club, or maybe you want to get buried with, and let's be honest, Nick, your favorite scotch. There's a lot of alcohol being buried.
Scotch anymore, but
passport, a nice passport.
Well, it could be a good one. I got another question real quick. What about cemetery plots?
Cemetery plots, that's another thing you could start getting in if you have a specific cemetery you want. Obviously with inflation, you're gonna probably spend a lot less money now comparably to when that year comes down the line.
Where do you go to do that? Do you go through your funeral director, or do you have to go to the cemeteries themselves?
So you can go to your funeral directors for support on where to go, but most of the time you're either going to the township where the cemetery is located, or a church, right? If it's owned by a church, if it's, St. Joe's Catholic Cemetery, it's usually St. Joe's Rectory that takes care of selling and buying plots. But also, like, if you go to, like, the township, like Ida Township Cemetery, you can go to the township that that cemetery's in, and they'll have how to buy the plots.
That brings up a good question for the checklist, though. Maybe that's another thing you got to add to the checklist is letting your family know that you do have plots.
Absolutely, and where the paperwork is for the plots. Because just like everything else, yes, most townships, most churches have a great filing system, but as we know, that could always change, or it could be lost in a fire, et cetera, et cetera. It's always good to have the paperwork too. So yeah, your paperwork on the pre-need, Nick. That's another thing. If you're gonna get a pre-need, let your kids know this is where everything is. My strong thing is to have everything kind of together. So you have a packet that your kids are looking for, right, in a specific location, or two places, but it's the same material. They can find most of everything. The title of the house, the title of the cars, the title of any vehicles or motorhomes. That's another thing families struggle to find is we know they have it, but we don't know where they are. So these are all things you can put together on top of physically putting together an obituary, the material that we're going to need for death certificates, like when you did things, your occupation, how many occupations have you had? How long were you at those occupations? Are you retired? What kind of hobbies did you like in life? What are your, were you part of any organizations or orders? That's another thing to add to the funeral, Nick. So let's say you were a Knight of Columbus, right? You might want the Knights to come and do a little service. Let's say you were a fireman. You might want the local firehouse to have a little ceremony at the visitation or the funeral, or maybe stand honor guard outside of the church or the funeral home. These are all things. If you have maybe even just a piece of paper you wrote up, or this is the person to call for I'm just bringing Ida because we live in Ida, but Ida Volunteer Firemen, or the Ida Shriners, or the Ida Knights of Columbus, or the Lions, or the Elks, the Elk House. Yeah, I'm not an elk, so I'm sorry if there's any elks out there.
And the last question I have for you is, can you personalize your funeral?
Oh, absolutely.
Meaning, can you do special scents or I don't know. I guess what have you experienced so far?
Well, as we come out of an untraditional side of our community, right? Before it was you had the visitation, you had the one day at the church. It was all church songs. You went to the cemetery. You had the luncheon at the church.
You had the rosary.
You had the rosary or
kneeling,
the scripture reading,
yeah.
or etc. Now, especially with people not so much religious, more spiritual, what they can do, what I've been noticing is you can have your own songs. You can have Metallica played at your funeral, or you can have a band come and play Metallica at your funeral. The thing I say about if you want special things, have them ready, because the idea is to usually when it comes to a funeral, we are on a deadline, right? We have a time crunch here. We got kids flying in. That's another thing too. Make sure that that the kids need to be able to fly in. Maybe they don't have money to fly in. Maybe that's something you need to have for them to be able to come home. Or another thing too is, I guess what I was going, I'm kind of rambling here, but can you make it, the more you can make it about the per individual that's dying, I think the better. But you have to take in realization too that you can't have your favorite band play at your funeral most of the time because they're doing other things. So
no, but I guess what I'm asking you is, does and maybe this is just your experience, so it might be subjective a little bit, but how much are the funeral homes allowing people to specialize funerals?
I'm saying the funeral homes and funeral directors are allowing let the families do what they're able to do, right? The idea is we're not going to repaint the walls for a specific funeral, right? But at the same time, if you want a Metallica song, a System of a Down song, and then something corporate song at your funeral, I don't know who would be listening to those as their three favorite bands, but let's say that's what they wanted. I'm sure most funeral homes would accept that. There does come a point with certain things that are requested that are value, like the funeral home's values may not, or honor. I've had people seriously ask me, can they be put in the casket naked and have their butt up at people? There's certain things funeral directors have the right to say, I wouldn't like that. That's uncomfortable. That's
And
just I'm not going to do that in my funeral home.
And with that being said, how much control do you have at churches?
Yeah, and that's a really good one. I was raised as a funeral director in a small town where I was told when you walk into a church, it's their house, right? It's the pastor, the priest, the rabbi, the chaplain, whoever is running that church. That's their rules. Yes, I would say this is usually how we do it, but we don't have to do it that way, Father or pastor. Or is there anything that you need me to know? Because most clergy and funeral directors work very well in sync. There are occasional funeral directors just as well as there's occasional clergy that are very, this is my way or the highway. But most clergy, most funeral directors are willing to work together. And honestly, Nick, now the family has more say than they ever had with churches, right? So a lot of pastors, priests will say, well, what does the family want to do? So, Nick, I think to kind of package what we kind of just all went through, right? Make sure you have a checklist. Start writing your own obituary. Start writing things when you did things, what years you did them, who your family members are, who are your preceded, what were your hobbies, what were your job, your occupation, maybe you were in the military. Get your paperwork all together. Get your DD-214, your life insurances, your agent. Put it all in one bundle so you can have a dinner with your family or your loved one or who just is going to be in charge and say, when this day comes, this is where you'll find everything.
Or, one thing that I got out of it, I think is just, call the local funeral home. If you got any questions or you're not sure what exactly is needed, I think they'll be more than willing to talk to you.
Oh, and I agree, Nick, because the one thing I can tell you is when a family comes in and everything's been done already, it is a relief to the children, to the spouse, to be like, I can just literally grieve and be at a funeral instead of I got to worry about this, that. So yeah, get your deck.
Get your deck of cards ready.
Get your death checklist in order. And Nick, I think it's time to move on to some Q&A.
Hey.
Q&A, everyone loves that Q&A.
So, Ben, here's a question. A burning question I've always had is if someone has a huge debt and they die, where does the debt go to? Does it just stop, or does it go to another family member?
A lot. I can't speak for every company or every debt that someone would have, like credit cards or whatnot. It honestly depends on it depends on where they are. I know different countries have different things with debt. I do know that if you co-sign on anything, that debt always translates to the next person. Most things when it comes to debt go through what's called probate, if that's set up, and probate basically sends an article out that anybody who this person is indebted to has the right to make a claim, right? And then if and once those claims are taken care of monetarily through the person that's died, then the rest of the money can go to the family or who is ever next to kin or what the will says. But most of that does get taken up in probate for debt. Outside of that, if there's like an interesting debt for some reason, I wouldn't be able to tell you. I'm not on the legal side or the debt side. I do have, I've heard some horror stories of farms and stuff with that, but that's not in every case by any means, form, or shape. So I think to answer on my side, Nick, is that probate usually takes care of all the debtors that, and then what's ever left over goes to the family.
Okay, thanks. That's a good answer. The second question. I'm trying to prepare for when it's my time to go, so my family won't have to. What are the top 3 things you should have prepared for a death checklist? So what are your top 3, Benny boy?
Top 3 things you should have prepared for a death checklist. Have your obituary written up. Have your pre-need done through your local funeral home. And then have a deep, in-depth conversation with whoever is in charge of you on where all of your documentation is. Bam. 3 things. Top 3 things.
Nailed it.
Nick, what's your top 3 things on death checklist on a psychological side?
That's a great question. I think 1, talk to your family. Sit with your family, kind of give them your own ideas of what your ceremony might look like, whether that is cremation or burial. Another thing I would say, if it is cremation, talk to your family about where you want your ashes to go, whether that is being buried, maybe scattered, whatever your decisions are. And then the third one would be do your best to not have any regrets at death.
Nice.
Those would be my top 3.
Nice. I liked it, Nick.
And maybe ask for forgiveness to yourself and to others.
Very good, Dr. Nick. Very good. Because
That was 4. I apologize. I did do 4. I apologize, but I think that's an important one. Well, thank you all for listening to this episode. I hope we answered all of your questions properly. If we didn't, please let us know. Email us, post something.
Yeah, those are good questions. Yeah, keep those good questions up. Keep us thinking.
And we really appreciate you guys listening.
Because if you aren't talking about death,
You sure ain't living.